Okay, so we're about to get started. This is third and final session on Heidegger's Parmenides, where we're just reading part 2 to finish up the book, and also assessments of the book overall. Might be a few more people coming in, but decided we should get started. There's plenty to say about the reading itself, which has some exciting pieces in it. I don't know if you guys are excited about them as I am. So I got a fair amount of material I want to go over. But I also want to talk quickly about what we're going to do for next time. So next time we're going to be reading another essay from Basic Writings, The Origin of the Work of Art. This session is going to be August 10th. That's 5 weeks from now. And the first reading will be the two sections. The first section, Thing and Work and Work and Truth. So that's pages 143 to 182. I'll put it out in the next meetup too, which is a little more than half. Might look like it's 2/3 of the essay, but the second session is going to be the last third of the essay plus all the epilogue and addendum, which add a considerable amount of material at the end. So, and the plan is for that to be on September the 7th, about a month later, 4 weeks later. So anyway, that's going to be the reading. If anyone doesn't have Basic Writings already, you can probably find Origin of the Work of Art in PDF on the web pretty easily, or Pete can find it for you. But we're going to try to read that over 2 sessions. And
so where were you reading up to the first session?
To page 182, which is the end of the section on work and truth, and right before the section on truth and art.
Yeah.
So there's a little intro, and then there's thing and work we're going to read, and work and truth we're going to read, and we're going to save truth and art for the second session. Okay, and as we read that, obviously we're interested in the everything the essay covers as it covers it, but we're also especially interested in the connection of all this to truth, arising, appearing, meaning, being, the open, all the kinds of stuff we're talking about in our session here, right? So art and truth overall is the, besides being the name of the third section of the essay, is the general thing we're interested in reading. That's why I want to do it next. Okay, that's just a little bit on the reading for next time. We can get started on the round robin of reactions. I assume if everyone's here, they probably do the reading, but Pete, you want to start us off?
Sure. I read through it. I've actually been pretty busy, so I didn't go back as much as I wanted. I guess what struck me is he's going back to the Greeks and saying the Greeks understood the open, but they didn't thematize it. But now for us, it's time to figure out what the essence of truth is for us. Uh, but he doesn't give us much guidance uh, on what that should be. So I'm interested to hear what others think our guidance should be for understanding our own essence of truth in our times. So that's it, I think.
Okay. I mean, I think he tells us quite a bit about essence of truth. I agree that it can sometimes be hard to see where he's moving over the line of interpreting the Greeks and interpreting for us. And he does say towards the end, but we don't know the essence of truth. Part of which is the typical philosophical, let's continue to inquire, remain on the way kind of thing. But he does let out some bombshells along the way, in my opinion. But we can get to that when we get to exposition about what he thinks truth is. I mean, Jimmy, we got a Jimmy and a James. We're going to go with Jimmy Marr first.
Um, I really love reading this stuff, but it evaporates from my mind almost as fast, or as my mom used to say, it's in one ear and out the other. And sometimes I wonder if that's not the point, but I'm certainly not sure by any means. And if anything that accomplishes for me, rather than really understanding anything, it's understanding the limitations of my understanding, where I seem almost not to know anything at all. And there's something liberating, possibly, about that. Because when
Yeah,
you think you know, or you expect that you're going to possibly understand, I don't know what to say, understand reality or understand what's going on. Well, it can be depressing. You know, if you feel depressed and you think you understand what's going on, then it's like, okay, well, it's okay to be really depressed. If you understand that, well, you don't know your ass from a hole in the ground. Then when things look dismal, at least there's that.
yes, it might be because you're misunderstanding and it's not as dismal as you think. I get it. There definitely is an attractiveness of open and on the way here for sure. But I think we can try to wrestle through to understand what he's trying to say, both about the Greeks and his own position. I realize it's challenging. The more challenging, the less Heidegger you've had. And there's no question that the peaks he gets to in this are in some ways a bit higher than the stuff we've had before. I would say they only get about as high as we got in the Essence of Truth essay last December, or the Origin of Work of Art, not the Origin of Work, the what is called Thinking book a few months, year ago. But okay, fine for first reactions. Is there any particular thing? I realize it's head spinning, but is there any particular thing you want to make sure that we cover that was? It may not be the only thing incomprehensible, but it would help you have a foothold if you did comprehend it.
Well, I guess the key word that could possibly use some clarification is the open.
Yep, absolutely. No, very good. We will definitely get there. All right, Dan, first reactions.
I I finished this about more than a week ago. I'm reading something else. I'm trying to remember and not mixing them, but let's see. I think it's we discussed it last time. So again, it's aletheia and what it means, and goes to the Greeks and he tries to see what's there. And as Pete said, the Greeks were not able to thematize it, and Heidegger now is trying, and it's kind of going into that why that was the case, how it kind of, as he says, collapsed with Plato or Aristotle and afterwards, and then I also like this kind of like the visual, and we discussed that last time a little bit, how they, for the Greek, everything like was connecting, and if there was thematized, was thematized in that direction, and how was the problem with that, and then he goes like open, not to see it in terms of light, but kind of he's pushing towards freedom and free. And I also like when he spoke, like he's contrasting that, reading that real poem and saying that's kind of the wrong way to do it, and why is that? And it's Nietzsche and the end of metaphysics and Hegel. And I think the overall is this idea that aletheia, being and so on, what it's so difficult for us because we always think in terms of something that presence of hand or tools at most, and it's so difficult for us to grasp this concept that is none of this. Like we fall to God, to something that is present, substance, ideas, and so on. But Heidegger is trying to go beyond all of this, and it's so difficult. It's so unique and so unexpected, and we have no bridges from our current, what he calls metaphysics, to this concept, and it's so difficult to jump there and say what it is without using these tools, and like all tools, metaphysics and so on. And every time we use this, we fall back, we lose touch, and we lose the grip on these things. And he's always trying to go there and approach it. And this entire book is kind of like he's saying the same thing in all his books, but slightly different ways. And he's kind of like is trying different paths, and he goes and then give up and try again, and he tries again and he tries again. And this ties also nicely with contributions and everything that's there. I think that's, if there is something that helps, it's that's in the background there, and he's trying a new approach here. He takes the true in different ways, and we are on the fourth way, and he thinks that's the main one, and I will stop here, but as we progress, I will say more.
Okay. I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot of, if I put it this way, philosophical history overlaying our ability to see some of the things he's talking about, but and he will spend a significant amount of time talking about them in part to clear them away. But he is also claiming here that the thing he wants us to see or do is simple if we aren't distracted by that, so to speak. So there is some of what he's doing here, which is deep assessment of, you could say metaphysics as a whole. I would say especially the Hegelian and Nietzschean end of it, that's also there in the Rilke at the end. It's a little strange that he chose to go to Rilke at the end, which is an example of what not to do after he just told you what to do, instead of going to an example of what to do. Yeah, we'll talk about a little some of those choices along the way. But there's lots of things going on here in terms of the assessment of the Greeks, relation to this to his own project, including the contribution stuff. Well, I don't want to steal my own thunder, so I'll wait for the round robins for going to some of the other things I think are going on here. But James, to distinguish you from Jimmy, I know you also go by Jim. So James, first reactions, did you do the reading, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we talked about it briefly. So my first initial reaction was jokingly, the concealment is not the unconcealment, but the concealment and the unconcealment are bathed in the light of the goddess, which is actually the event happening and her voice speaking in the event. And then I'm like, okay, I'm getting lost. It's like, it all sounds great. It's beautiful, but I'm like,
Can't keep it all
I'm out of
straight.
Yeah, I'm out of practice. It's been a while since I've dug into Heidegger, so I remember this from being in Time and Other Works. So I did want to, was something I really want to make sure I understand. It seems to like, this is where another area of confusion for me. So myth as the mode of disclosure, which is the goddess speaking of aletheia, truth as unconcealment, and her voice is the event. But I thought that the place, like we talked about, the place where being happens, that isn't that supposed to be Dasein? So now I'm like, wait a minute, here he's like the goddess, but he breaks it up like, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So am I wrong about that, or is that
so the most, in a way, most difficult piece here is that he's trying to disentangle appearing to anything like a consciousness versus original arising appearing. And the claim is something like that sometime shortly after the Greeks or during the Greeks, people start thinking of appearance only as appearing to psyche, right? And that's in itself already a subjectivizing move, if you get me. And he's trying to distinguish that from the original sense of arising, which is more like being active existence into truth, something like that. And the conflation of the two, or the replacement of original arising with appearing to a consciousness, is something that he is diagnosing as what sets metaphysics on the trajectory that he's calling an oblivion of the original beginning, or a forgetting of what was involved in original disclosure, original beginning. The way in which that can be confusing is if someone is reading Dasein as just consciousness for Heidegger, they will think that, but aren't you also one of these consciousness people who thinks that being is only appearing to the consciousness? And basically a more subjectivist reading of Heidegger and what Heidegger means by Dasein in that vein can't deal with this section, right? This section is meant to break such a reading of what he means by Dasein. Dasein is not simply consciousness. And if someone reads Dasein as simply consciousness and they don't distinguish between original arising and appearing to suke, soul, they will not see what distinction he is making here. But in himself, he's I think pretty darn clear about this. The whole point to him of Dasein is that it is trying to break through to the level of the original arising and not simply it's not simply locked in a mind anymore, right? This is the way in which he thinks he is used phenomenology to break out of the Husserlian box, if you get me.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, that's again, that is one of the themes in this whole section is to distinguish between appearing to a mind or consciousness versus original arising, and to think of what lethe and aletheia mean on the level of original arising, not just on the level of appearing to consciousness. And this is also related to whether or not the contrasting term of aletheia is lethe or is pseudos. Pseudos or fake is an appearing that is deceptive, that is already in the frame of does the consciousness understand or is the consciousness deceived? Something like that.
Right. And just so I also make sure, and I don't want to take too much more on this part, to make sure I understand when it's she's directing, she directs us to the path of truth, but not correctness as something we would grasp. That sort of reminds me of Nietzsche a bit, but I want to make sure I understand that it's never actually the grasping of truth or the correctness. It's just that she's illuminating the path to it.
So, I mean, Heidegger thinks that correctness is a later interpretation of truth that comes in, I would say, Aristotle, and after he thinks sometimes Plato, already beginning in the Theaetetus level. But truth as correctness is what he is contrasting with truth as original appearing. And he's saying that that's a transition or change in the meaning of truth, and he is correlating that change in the meaning of truth in the positive sense with a change in what its alternative or negative is. So truth pseudos is closer to the correctness interpretation, whereas truth lethe is closer to the original appearing understanding. But this is subtle because there's things going on in both, and he has to allow that pseudos is already there in the earliest of the Greeks as a contrast to aletheia. It's not something that only comes in like with late Sophists or Aristotle or something. It's there in Homer. So it's not simply a time layered distinction between these things. It's more like a depth layer distinction than a time layer distinction. But yeah, we will try to sort through all those as we get through the our part of the text, but some of that was meant to be made clear in the earlier parts of the book, or the previous book. But we can still come back to it. Josh, first of all, welcome. Sorry for getting you in, but we're on first reactions.
Yeah, well, I found this work to kind of highlight the aspects of Heidegger's project that I find kind of the weakest. So first of all, that the arguments that he makes that rely on the Greeks, the earliest Greeks in particular, to kind of buttress his position, those I've always found weak and not plausible, which doesn't mean that I don't appreciate what I can find them valuable nonetheless, because he finds them valuable. So I want to know, in spite of the fact, that I am critical of the claims that he makes, or the way that he wants to read the Greeks. What I'm interested in is, okay, given the fact that he does read them this way, I will use them as a way to understand more deeply what he's trying to get at, which is, of course, is what I'm interested in. The metaphor of light also is another area where I go, I'm thinking of where Derrida, for example, deconstructs Heidegger's use of that metaphor of light or of vision. That's a second one. And the third one would be the distinction he makes, which always drives me crazy, between the animal and rocks versus those are three weak areas, and then make it difficult for me in this work to kind of this is always what I'm looking for, is to find more evidence in favor of, subtle, nuanced interpretations of the most difficult concepts that he's dealing with, and it made it more difficult for me to use this work as a way to sort of locate, that kind of evidence.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that Plato and Plato's understanding of light and clearing is definitely being used here, partly as a foil to distinguish his own position on that, but it's also, I would say, closer to Heidegger's own position than he sometimes lets on. And as some people later detect in that a residual Platonism that they don't like, as opposed to that they do like, it's a perfectly fair thing to say, because the parallels of his understanding of the structure of clearing and Plato's understanding of the structure of the light of the good in the relationship between the mind and truth, or something like that, is actually quite close. The interpretation of Theia as vision, as sight, as well as God, or the goddess, and the underlying thing inside Lethe, all of those, I think, is accurate interpretation of that layer of the Greeks. I think that it also shows that Plato is not distorting that background of Greek thought or Greek mythos, if you like. Platonic myth and Platonic philosophy are in touch with things which are there in the Greek language and in the Greek background mythology, for better or for worse. I have a more positive opinion of those things than you or Derrida might have, but the correspondence is definitely there. There are differences. There are ways in which he is definitely distinguishing himself from all that, and there are things which he claims are not seen even in that level of the Greeks, which I think this piece of this work shows is a deeper level than the claim about replacement of truth is unveiling with truth is correctness, something like that. The latter is a more surface phenomena here. But the other thing that this section makes quite clear to me is that the attempts to read Heidegger in a more subjectivist vein don't work. And I don't mean they don't work because such a philosophy might not be consistent. I just mean such a philosophy would not be Heidegger, right? It's not what Heidegger's actual intention is here. So yeah, the questions you raise are good ones. We have to ask, is this a place where Heidegger is being fundamentally Platonist more than he lets on, or not? That would be a fair question to ask. Okay, these are definitely good things to raise here. Are we ready to move on to the exposition section, or do people have other things they want to say before we jump into that? Just a hands up round if people wanted to react to anything anyone already said already.
So just a couple things. Well, one is I think it's always helpful to understand, or what Heidegger is saying is that with metaphysics, where metaphysics is always thinking about beings and trying to understand beings, whereas he wants to get to what makes it possible for beings to appear. And I think that's helpful to keep in the background when reading him. And the other one is, since this text
Sorry, I
is
want to just
about
slow down there for a second. So I agree with that, but realize that the latter is also something that some of these historical philosophers also touch on themselves. And Heidegger sometimes will say that they're doing metaphysics, but when they're touching on those, how beings can arise to appear in the first place themselves, they're not doing metaphysics in his later sense. They're doing the same thing he's trying to do. And there are elements of that in Heraclitus, which you saw in early Greek thinking clearly, and in Plato. But sorry, go ahead.
right. So Heraclitus and Plato are before Aristotle kind of
Sure.
systematizes thinking about beings. And then after Aristotle, that's how the rest of the tradition understands philosophy.
He certainly
And
reiterates
takes
that
that
claim here. Yeah,
aspect,
yes, yes.
they take that aspect of Aristotle, and that defines the rest of Western philosophy as metaphysics. For Heidegger, even though you could say, well, Kant in parts is looking at what makes beings possible. Maybe parts of Descartes are doing that, but really they're still in metaphysics talking
Yeah,
about,
I think Kant is really
things.
only asking about what makes experience possible, which is not quite the same thing. But yeah, fair, fair.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right that that's the picture he gives. I'll have my own interpretation of his evidence for that here. In the the what comes after Aristotle, he has some allowances here where he thinks that some of the things in Aristotle still had both notions, even though only one of them predominated in how he was read afterwards. Right? He sort of allows that. I think that some of the term that he decries is clearly happening in Aristotle already, and I would even locate it slightly before. He also mentions the confrontation with the sophists and the effects that this has on the Socratics, meaning on Plato and Aristotle. And I'll definitely talk about that in the exposition part. But yes, he wants to distinguish these things, and he wants to focus more on the how do beings occur, or not only just how, but I mean the contributions version of the second question is, how does being essentially occur, right? Not even beings. But okay, yeah. So as opposed to the what is the being of the beings? So that's the distinction we know from contributions layer that we can bring along with us here. I still think that we have to be careful when we engage on things on the level of Plato's thinking about the plane of lethe and the level of myth, about which of those things is being engaged, right? Because I think some of that definitely does get at a how being essentially occurs, not just a the being of the beings.
Right. And so the other bit that I found helpful, and with the plane of lethe and forgetting, is to go back to Parmenides, since this is the title of the text. And I was reading an introduction to metaphysics from 1935, the section on Parmenides. And he says, so Parmenides says, or the goddess tells Parmenides, there's three ways: the way of being, the way of non-being, and the way of doxa. And that all three involve uncovering or discovering or unveiling.
The latter,
And
though, is more Heidegger's gloss than Parmenidean original.
yeah,
Parmenides says you have to take all the paths, and not Parmenides. Heidegger says you have to take all the paths in Introduction to Metaphysics, and Parmenides has the goddess say, you have to take this mortal path, and there's also this divine path, but you can't take the other path. You can't take the path of the altogether not. So there's a definite change in the attitude toward the path of the altogether not between the goddess in Parmenides and Heidegger in Introduction.
right. And so, and then with the vision thing, that the Greeks had phusis and things appeared to them. Uh, and I'm not quite sure. In some places, it seems like he's saying, uh, well, that's the way of doxa, but obviously to the Greeks, phusis was everything.
Yeah, I don't think he quite
So
says that. I don't think he quite says the light thing is way of doxa. He does criticize the notion that you can understand the Greeks by just saying they were a visual people, as though that was a fact that fell from the sky, right? Without understanding why they would be a visual people. And he's sort of angling towards the reason that they are a visual people is because they are people whose thinkers are trying to say being. But we definitely have to get into all the ways in which visible and light are paradigms of being and appearing here. Sorry, let you keep going.
So it seems to me that in terms of what is the essence of truth for us, going back to these three ways of Parmenides, that it's the way of being as thinking, the open is going to be our way, our necessary way of truth now. And I just wanted to say that explicitly to see what reaction that gets.
I mean, there is already a relating of being to thinking in Parmenides that is to some degree something which Heidegger preserves, and to some degree something which he Heidegger thinks is already moving in the direction of the subjective closing that he is decrying as metaphysics. So we have to be careful with the thinking and being are the same level of the Parmenides things. In other words, the way of being as Parmenides describes it isn't quite the same as the thinking of the open as the free that we're getting from Heidegger here. The free is not a word that Parmenides would use to describe the divine path.
Yeah, but so he says somewhere that the open is necessary for all ways, the three ways of being, non-being, and
Yes, but he thinks that that's
But
because he's reached,
Parmenides,
he Heidegger thinks that in reaching the level of the open, he has reached a more fundamental level than the ways.
by explicitly being aware of the open as a necessary condition for being
Yes,
in
and
any way.
and he's not claiming that that's Parmenides, he's claiming that's himself.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
also part of rehabilitating the way of the altogether not, by the way. But we have to ask, leaving aside Parmenides for a second, does Plato already have a doctrine on that ground too? I think he does. But that doesn't mean that Heidegger agrees with him. Heidegger has a similar structure and a slightly disagreeing interpretation of that structure that Heidegger claims is more fundamental than Plato's understanding of that structure. When I say of that structure, I'm talking about the idea that there is some required intermediary of openness and light that yokes together being and mind. That structure is already there in Plato and the Republic. It's pretty much submerged in people after him, and it's not already there in Parmenides before him. You might find some echoes of it in Heraclitus. But that's the closest to the open as, the closest in the Greeks to the open as Heidegger is describing it here. And it's a place where Plato is, if I can put it this way, an authentic Greek, meaning he's reading things into it that are there in the meaning of the words and are there in the background mythology that he is using to interpret these things. Go ahead, sorry, go ahead.
So even if the Greeks had the open unthematized, what is original to Heidegger is the event.
Absolutely.
As a critical
and also
thing.
correct, and also the description of the open as the free. The free and the event are the things which he is most distinctly adding, that are distinctly his own here. The open is a replacement for the light of the good in the Republic as a structure, but the naming of it as the open shifts away from anything like good and even from light to the space of the open in which that the light traverses, something like that, just in terms of the metaphor. But it's still a similar visual metaphor, and it's still the same, a required third, right, structurally speaking. So that's a place where, as Heidegger is exploiting his stuff, is the notion, you know, I've got a little sign going off my head, Plato was here, right? But the things which are definitely distinctly Heidegger here is that he diagnoses the content of that open as the free. And you're right that he wants to institute all of this inside something like event. Okay, we've, I don't know how many people we lost, but yes, that's where we're heading. There's several, important things along the way. But the section where he explains how he understands the open, how he understands the open as the free, that's all thematized here. He only kind of alludes to the event aspect of it, as opposed to in contributions where that's the whole focus, right? Here, he only kind of alluding to the event aspect. The other thing that he, another way you can think of that event aspect is he does make a theme here, the notion of the first beginning as opposed to the primordial beginning, or the original arising appearing. There's this notion of a hidden primordial beginning, which is still concealed in the first beginning, something like that. And there's this event-like character of in the history of the thinking of being, these things which are at first only known by their aftermath and effects, right? You see the Greek interpretation of arising appearing as physis. You do not see the experience that led rise to the interpretation of physis. Anyway, there's a, Heidegger is definitely doing something where he's claiming that there's a level beneath the level that Plato is himself explicating, which is the, think of it this way, the historical terrain of Plato seeing what he saw as historical event, something like that. What is this related? How is this related to some of the stuff that's going on in Plato and the Greeks? The corresponding thing here is this notion of saving, rescuing, and is there an aspect of sheltering involved in truth? Heidegger does some pretty forceful overreadings that he himself allows, or overreadings and readings back and reading and interpretations into, to find a closedness inside the openness of unconcealment, to find something that can be called a sheltering. But the reason he's doing that is he wants there to be some notion of arriving at truth or arriving in truth as a sheltering, and it's also a saving. I think it's already a saving there in the Greeks, saving into truth, but the thing which is there as a moment in the Greeks that is not there in Heidegger's understanding of truth as a, I think of it this way, a saving thing to arrive at, or a saving place to arrive, is for the Greeks, that is partly about escaping from time, not being embedded in its flow. For the Greeks, lethe, forgetting, oblivion, is a mortal future, and saving from forgetfulness, saving from oblivion, and saving from the fleetingness of mortality into the divine are also an escape from time as a structure. And Heidegger doesn't thematize that, but it's clearly going on here. He alludes to it in this question of truth as a saving thing, without talking about what it is saving from. It's just saving from oblivion of disregard or something in the way Heidegger is putting it. But I think that it's very clear that for the Greeks, it's more than that. And Heidegger brings out the fact that, Kronos is a god outside of Jupiter, or outside of Zeus, right? And that is correct. I have some other things to add to that, right? They have another thing which they put outside Kronos, which is Uranus, the open. The sky is the open. And in the Greek mythology, it is older than Kronos. So they have a notion of an eternal open that is deeper than time itself. And that is also related to why someone like Plato will experiencing rescuing into truth as escape from the flowing that cannot be stopped, something like that. So the point is that the structure of the background mythology and of the metaphysics is not unrelated to this changed attitude towards time. Now, Heidegger or Heideggerian might want to psychoanalyze that of, you invent metaphysics to try to find a structure where you can escape from mortality. There's lots of ways you can read that. But Heidegger wants to leave the structure of time inside the open. And I would also say that the fact that he calls this, he calls the open, or the open, the open is what he calls it, the free. This to me is also a perfectly distinctive, I want to say, not just to Heidegger, but to German idealism and anything related to Romanticism, anything like that, where Plato sees truth as enabled by the light of the good. The German idealist sees the free. The place of the good in Plato is taken by the free in German idealism. And you can think of that as a different theology, if you like, but it's also a different, which of those words is highest. To the German idealists, free is a higher term than good, and good only happens as a minor thing inside free. And that is not true for the Greeks. Sorry.
Right. So not having read, the German idealists very deeply, am I correct in understanding that this notion of the free comes from Schelling and not from Fichte and Hegel, or is there for all of them?
It's there for all of them. It is definitely more distinctive in Schelling, but it's there in all of them. It's there in the idea of the world as will as being deeper than the world as a representation. It survives there even in Nietzsche, even when that will becomes less than rational. The free as the unconstrained, as a highest, is a structure you see across German idealism. It does have some pre-modern precursors, but you'd have to go back to people like Dionysius the Areopagite, Neoplatonism, and the sections of Hegel's logic that start from that same the being nothing structure is itself embedded in the free, something like that. Or the unconstrained as such. But again, all of those things in the if I go this way, the late ancient world versions of these things are embedded in metaphysics and theology, right? Is God the good? Is God the free? Is God being? Different theologies. As the completely unconstrained, as the infinite and free, that's what you're getting closer to here. So you could correlate those different theologies to these different philosophical moments, but I think that that's symptom, not cause, right? There is a temperamental and valuative attunement that puts free higher in the German idealists, and it's down to the base of their culture. It's not just the result of a overarching metaphysical image kind of formation, right? It's the other way around. It's the attunement or drive that's projecting that, if you get me, that freedom is highest or free is highest. Anyway, these are the places where I find Heidegger here most distinct compared to the Greeks. It's what's most un-Greek about him. You would never find Plato or Parmenides calling the open space of the unconstrained in which the arising appearing first happens the free. We also saw that, by the way, in the essay last December on the essence of truth, where he also had the line that the essence of truth is freedom, and resistance to this is based upon the idea that the freedom involved must be a property of man. And he's not talking about the freedom of man. He's talking about something more like the freedom of the transcendental to which there is an open detachment, something like that. The mystery is another word for the free. Okay. Again, I don't know how much everyone is following as we go into all these nuanced things, but I wanted to get to some of the things that Josh is most concerned about where Heidegger himself comes out, as opposed to the only the ways in which he's getting something from the Greeks or just responding to something from the Greeks. These are the parts of him that are distinctive to him in this section. Okay. Hands up, Dan.
Yeah, going back to this, to what you just said, and also Josh objection, and it seems like he places this like you. I agree with you that the Greeks didn't see the open there in the truth in aletheia, but they place kind of according to, at least according to Heidegger, aletheia as the most fundamental thing. So kind of like this, and even for Heidegger in this structure here, and for like truth is more fundamental than anything else, like to Heidegger. And I think like Heidegger in trying to in his project, he's trying the different approaches, and eventually he realized that truth is the, like aletheia is the most, to get at the core of his project, you need to go through. I think like more and more later he said that that's the main way to go there.
I agree with you that the truth layer is fundamental, but it's fundamental because it's where these different traditions touch, right? It's the playing field. It's not the content of it. Plato's light metaphysics of how the light of the good makes understanding possible is a different understanding of truth than calculative correctness, and both those are different from Heidegger's intellectual intuition of the free, something like that, right? All of those are about truth, right? So truth is not an answer to of one of those three, right? Truth is the problematic. It's the terrain on which the history is transpiring. That's the way I would put it. So you're not wrong that truth is the fundamental layer. That's why we've been following this thread of the different essays where he talks about essence of truth, and this is one of them. And the next one is going to be about how that truth is related to art, etc. We've been following the thread of truth in Heidegger, right? But that thread is not an answer to the question; it's the terrain. And the thing which is interesting here is that he comes very close to trying to tell you an answer as his answer to that question of how truth is now. This is like Pete's question. And how truth is now for us is it's the open in which being can originally appear, that is to be understood as the groundless and the free. And that's getting pretty close to telling you what he thinks, right? I don't want to bury what I consider the lead here in one respect, because it is easy in all of this complexity and all these nuanced historical differences to overlook something he did here on page 149. This is I'm going to jump in here. This is the second to last paragraph from the bottom on right hand side 149. To think being does not require a solemn approach and the pretension of arcane erudition or the display of rare and exceptional states, as in mystical raptures, reveries, and swoonings. All that is needed is simple wakefulness in the proximity of any random, unobtrusive being, and awakening that all of a sudden sees that the being is. And he will go through that and talk about that as the leap. First thing, when reading that, one should not just read it as something which he is saying about something. One should immediately perform the experiment, take the measurement, do what he said, try it, right? He's claiming here that if there aren't other overly sophisticated philosophical bits of machinery and debris in your way, you can see the open in which being occurs. And I'm using see, right? The Platonic and Greek way of putting it. All the complexity comes from the ways in which it is easy to do that and think that you're doing it correctly when you're not doing it correctly, or do that and overlay how you interpret the experience with too many bits of machinery, philosophy, or metaphysical doctrine that get in the way of doing it, right? But the point that he's making is that the intellectual realization that the unobtrusive being is performing the act of existence, that do not need to do. It is doing that in the unconstrained. It is doing that in the free. It is doing that in the groundless, right? That is an original arising from which other things depend, not the other way around. That's what he's calling the leap here, right? And I just want to pause here for a second and ask, right, for both the people who know all the history and stuff and for the people who this is relatively new, is that something you think you can easily do? And does this speak to you? Do you see anything when you try to do this? He's claiming here that there is a simple act of intellectual perception that is possible here that gets you to the thing that everybody is talking about. So that instead of just hearing them talk about it with words and thinking about them as doctrines that have, lineages of dependencies, you can examine the thing about which they are discussing, right? It's a phenomenological moment, if you get me. So my first question is, in reading through this, did anyone see that as an invitation to an anchoring original experience yourself? Did anyone do it? Or does anyone think that this is trivial, useless, too flighty? You cannot possibly mean that you're hanging so much on that, right? Any of the other such objections? Reactions to the invitation to exercise simple wakefulness in the proximity of a random, unobtrusive being, awakening that all of a sudden sees that the being is.
Well, he ends the previous passage by saying that the simple is the most difficult.
Yes.
So he is saying that it's, and I think we these days when we try to understand something, we always make it more complicated than it is. We try to go to some people, see what they said, and then by doing that, we step away from that thing, especially this kind of thing that Heidegger is talking about.
We chain beings together and histories together and theories together, and those chains are obstructions between us and the experience that is being invited here. Agreed. And that's what can make it hard. But let's acknowledge the fact that those things can make it hard and then not make it exceptionally hard on ourselves. Pete, do you find this easy to bypass and easy to do, or is it incomprehensible?
So it depends on the thing. Is it something that's present? Like if it's something like a work of art that's present before us, or is
the directive is that it be unobtrusive. So it has to have not been the focus of your attention before, right? It had the shift of attention to it and the shift of attention from its meaning or content to the fact of its existence. Those are the two moves being described. The unobtrusive being can be a present being. It doesn't have to be a present being. Its presence or absence is not highlighted as critical here, but he is saying unobtrusive precisely because he's not talking about that which is overwhelmingly the center of your attention because its meaning is, broadcasting loudly to you before you perform this operation, right? He wants you to see the arising, appearing out of background, not into anything like truth of the being, of the unobtrusive being.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So that's tough because the things that we don't pay attention to often are the things that clobber us later. And then now they have our attention. So we're like, oh, I got clobbered. So now whenever something does come into our awareness, we're almost conditioned automatically to pay very close attention and start analyzing it.
So
that's extremely difficult.
I get all that, but the whole point of this exercise is that instead of waiting for the being to clobber you with its demands for your attention, the thing which is commanding your attention is these lines on a page written by Heidegger. Josh?
I want to say that the conclusion that Heidegger is reaching here concerning the relationship between that which is the experience of the beginning versus that which sort of conceals it and covers over it. That very setup sort of seems to predetermine the relationship between the two. That is to say that the conclusion being that this is something difficult, very difficult. This is something uncommon. This is something that, going back to being in time, it was very rarely, when he talked about it in terms of authenticity, it was something that was very, very rarely experienced. And so I think that, so my first point is that I think that, he's setting up the terms of understanding the relationship between the two in such a way that that is the conclusion that one would reach. But then I would want to sort of dig beneath that and ask certain questions here, which is, what is it? And I think it's a very thing that's troublesome for me that you pinpointed in terms of sort of a Platonic, aspect of the way that that Heidegger articulates opening in terms of light. That makes it necessary to have this dichotomization that between kind of the proper and the improper, the authentic and the inauthentic, the immediate experience versus that which covers over it, and that kind of a dichotomization to me still it sort of, on the one hand, it leads to the kind of conclusions that Heidegger reaches, but on the other, it seems to me that perhaps it still is not is fully satisfying.
Sorry, when you say fully satisfying, you have to explain to me what you think are the conditions that fully satisfying is called upon to satisfy, and what is doing the calling.
Well, instead of having two options that sit there in front of us and presupposing that they exist as two sides, as two alternatives, that's not historical. That's not radically temporal enough. The radically temporal is to say, all right, now I will, the achievement that Heidegger is articulating in terms of this dichotomy, this going back and forth between that which conceals and that which which exposes, needs to be sort of undermined in favor, or can be undermined in favor of a recognition that we always are in contact with that beginning differently. That if we say, okay, now I have,
the closest you got to that is in the previous paragraph where he says every person in history knows being immediately, though without acknowledging it as such, right? So the bringing to conscious awareness is indeed only a change in a relation that is already there, right? But it is the one which has this exaphanes character, this shining forth character, this bringing to light character that he is calling a leap. And he is, the leap is away from attention to the being and onto the fact that it is, and specifically towards something which was unobtrusive previously, so that the focus is not on the being and the relations of the being and its its relation to your own most possibilities and all that kind of stuff, but to the event of being that it is performing, the act of being that it is performing, to be a little bit Aquinian about it. And he is saying no more here than that, as uncommon as this may be, it is a possible act. This sleep is a possible act, and that it is what gives us immediate access from his point of view towards the experience of the open and the ungrounded, the open and the groundless.
And the way that you depicted that well, but that doesn't that imply that there's a return to something, even as he reminds us that what we're returning to as origin is not something that's behind us in a historiological sense, but
it's
nevertheless,
it's something that's around us, and it's the only behind us in a historiological sense is the ability to recover something like what an experience of arising, appearing, and that notion of phusis might have meant to the Greeks too, but we're only seeing that because we can have a corresponding experience ourselves, right? So in a way, this is him trying to ground what he means by the open, the free, the groundless. He's trying to explain to you what that structure is to him by showing it to you. And he does think that that thing that he's showing to you is part of the experience of the arising, appearing physis word that was so crucial to the Greek understanding of truth. Right? He is claiming that this is a point of contact where by redoing that our way, we are recovering something of the first beginning that we can see was pointing at a same. I don't know if that helps, but he is both doing something himself that's establishing the meaning of his terms of open, groundless, free, right? As he's using it here, but he also is relating all that to the structure of aletheia as he thinks the Greeks experienced it. Sorry, Dan, but then back to Josh. Dan first.
Yeah, I think to me the point here is like and goes back to this why early Greeks they experience the basic experience for early Greeks was physis, and to experience that for us is no longer that. For us is to experience means to experience this oblivion, and not just that, but the oblivion of oblivion, and that's kind of the basic. I think.
I mean,
that's what we are called to do by Heidegger.
Heidegger is very radically claiming right here that oblivion of oblivion is purely voluntary, and you can step out of it. Right? He's inviting you to step out of it in the course of reading this by following a directive that he thinks will allow you to see what he means by the groundless. And you can doubt that, or you can just try it and do it and see what happens. I recommend the latter. I think he has a case. Sorry, Josh.
Yeah, shouldn't the recovery of anything be affected by the act of attempting the recovery? That the act of attempting it is radically historical. That is to say, it presents something new, historically new, and the fact that it presents something historically new, that I right now at this moment, whoever I am, wherever I'm situated, however I am, in attempting to recover, am affecting the recovery. I'm affecting the very sense of what it means to recover, and affecting the very sense of the origin that I'm trying to get back to. So that would make it radically futural.
Absolutely, yeah. But I mean that's what Heidegger is doing here, and he's even telling you the ways in which he thinks that this is something which was there in the Greek beginning, but not thematized in the Greek beginning. It's meant to be an unthought of the Greek beginning. He thinks that the thing he's just admonished you to do, and then the interpretation is going to give out in the next paragraph or two, as the groundless, the open, the free, that interpretation on it, he thinks is a he calls it a reading back. He says that reading back is always futural. It's always, tying it to what it means for us. But he's the one doing it, and he's inviting you to take part in a parallel now. He's not inviting you to innovate on what he has done. He's inviting you to keep step with him in the interpretive rereading of the Greeks, to think they're unthought and to see the ground of the arising, appearing that they were talking about with physis in this structure of the groundless free, which he thinks is what it is for us, as Pete was getting to earlier. What the open is for us is the groundless free, but that is meant to be the recovery of the aletheia physis level of the Greek understanding in the first beginning. So it's claiming to be both an act of interpretation and an act that's going beyond it to think the unthought that was there, and to invite us to participate in it now as something which sets present philosophy on a course that both recovers and means to step beyond what the Greeks did. That's his futorial aspect. So it's not absent. But it's his own action, not yours, that he's tying to that futorial.
I mean, and that is a good point, and that did really, that represents sort of the powerful critique, that implicit critique of Husserl's, atemporal beginning, this apodictic, truth of transcendental subjectivity that on the one hand is meant to be in history, and but on the other hand sort of in some senses out of history, and Heidegger, it was so important for Heidegger to expose what was lacking in that way of thinking.
So I would agree with you and say that this entire part 2 of this is, an anti-Husserlian manifesto all the way around, right? Not only in that historical sense, but also in the way in which is taking issue with the appearing as appearing to a consciousness as being the fundamental structure of appearing to, as opposed to there being an original arising appearing out of the background of groundless into truth, right? And that is also an implicit criticism of Husserl, and all the ways in which he is attacking subjectivist philosophy here, usually not under the name of Husserl, but using under the name of Nietzsche and Hegel in this section, is the same kind of thing, right? All of those, he thinks that they are radically subjectivizing what is actually a structure of truth, and even of accessible truth. So I don't disagree with you that there's criticism of Husserl here, but it's not just on the history front. It's also on the he's too subjective front.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I agree completely.
Okay. Sorry. Did we get people's round of reactions to all that? I realized there was a lot going on there. Okay. So I consider this invitation to experience the free. He says this is how the free comes. The groundless is the free. This is how it comes to light. When Heidegger tells you a simple experimental procedure to perform with your mind, whether you're reading Being Time or this, you should try it and see what results from it. Why are there going to be plenty of people who think that experiment proves much less than Heidegger thinks that it proves? The answer is they're going to overlay that act with a whole bunch of non-Heideggerian interpretations, especially subjectivist interpretations, that are going to reduce its importance, right? And this is kind of the subject matter of a bunch of the other stuff in our section. When he gets to Rilke at the end and claims that Rilke is cannot see this whole structure of the open because he's stuck in a kind of Nietzschean metaphysics, or the places where he talks about the relationship between Hegel and Nietzsche, as Nietzsche is like a counter essence to the absolute spirit in Hegel, but both of them on this subjectivist side, or the ways in which he tries to show that the understanding of people and nation that he finds around him is still a subjectivism, and that there's no Herder without Descartes, and you could say there's no Nietzsche without Hegel in the same way. All of those are criticisms of the subjectivist philosophy that would interpret what he just did as just a subject-object relation, right? In a subject-object relation, the experienced being of the unobtrusive being is not really an experienced being. The only thing that was experienced was that it was an over against of your mind, that was an outside your mind that you knew was not you because it resisted your will to be Fichtean about it, or because you couldn't change it by imagining it to be changed. That's how you know it's outside. That's what you get in the sort of German idealistic tradition, right? So and from that you would only arrive at that the meaning of the being to you is a not me that cannot be imagined differently, or that at least imagining it differently doesn't make it different, right? That's all you get. That's all you would get if you were a Fichtean and performed that experiment, if that makes sense. I don't know if people are interested enough in the more subjectivist sides of German idealistic philosophy to see that that's going on here. He's inviting you to do something that the subjectivist would think is trivial in its consequences and doesn't refute them. maybe too far afield to see that there's any point in that. Okay. I want to come back to the Greeks as visual. Before we get to the Greeks as visual, though, there's a word, the open. The open is the unclosed. Adello is the word in Greek. And adello means something like open, but it means adello because it's not adello, and dello means something like closed. But the dello actually, if you trace down all the roots, really means something more like visible. And adello means something more like invisible. The lo in adello is pretty much Indo-European for capable of being seen. It's like lo there, even in Sanskrit. So adello as open, as unclosed, as disclosed, is already still pointing to this visible business. I'm mentioning this first because I want to get to the visual, to the discussion of the visual aspect of all this in the Greeks, because he does bring out here, I think we talked about earlier, but he does bring out here that the day and of the goddess and inside aletheia are about vision, and he even ties it to theory, right? Theory is the highest activity, is seeing is the highest activity, because seeing is what gives access to being. The seeing involved is definitely not simply bodily seeing with eyes. Eyes don't see anything. If you doubt it, ask how much a dead person sees, right? The eyes need the brain, the eyes need the mind to see. So the seeing that's being talked about here is the mental seeing level, if you get me. And this is a point that's already made in Plato. But throughout all the Greek background words here and all the Greek background mythologies here, stepping into truth, stepping into being, arising, appearing in the first place, are everywhere connected with light, visible, not invisible, etc. And conversely, all of the things for closure, all the things for forgetting, are all the unseen, the unseeable, the invisible. In the Parmenides poem that we began with, right, we're going to the temple of the goddess that stands past the gates of day and night, right? So you find the goddess of truth on the point where day and night cross into one another, dawn, but that overarching metaphor of visible, invisible, as not just visual sight, but as being or not being, true or not true, alive or dead, divine or mortal, all through Greek mythology, right? And not just Greek mythology. Some of these structures go back to the Sumerians, right? I mean, it's deep, right? Okay, so I don't think it makes sense to have there be any criticism in that. The one thing that it will mean, though, is that the myth in the sense of the image, or the image, what's the point? All the ways in which you get like a light metaphysics in Plato are authentically Greek, right? They're not some later distortion. They're not leaving behind aletheia, right? They're not replacing it with some other perspective. That is the Greek perspective, right? So first of all, any questions about the whole light and light word structure that is running through not just the lethe and aletheia, but also the adello, open, closed, disclosure, all of that?
Well, can we tie it in when we get towards the end? Because I had already mentioned earlier wanting to understand the goddess in the way that she points to the path and the clearing, and how light works in with that, because that was part of what confused me a bit with this unconcealment and concealment and uncovering, all wrapped inside and bathed in the light that points toward the area of the clearing, and those kind of things. Like the
light doesn't point towards an area of the clearing. Okay, so there's two things going on here. First of all, the clearing as the space that the light can traverse is an extra structure that Heidegger is insisting upon that is his own. The thing that you get from the Greeks is the notion that the open, the lit up, the visible are assimilated to one another or made parallel to one another, but the light is understood as something in addition, right? There's light needs to beam into the space of the open to make the lighted. The structure you get in Plato and the Republic is that you've got the mind trying to understand things, the thing to be understood, but it takes a light between them that is coming from some third to yoke them together, right? So the yoke of the light is the image that's used there, and that's Heidegger talks about in the Essence of Truth essay, where he covers through the allegory of the cave and then all of that period, all that section of Republic, I mean, before he gets to the section on Theaetetus in the first half of his Essence of Truth book. What's the point of this? The point of this is that that structure of light yoking mind and being together is doing the same work for Plato that the open is doing for Heidegger, right? Open or place or site where being appears, right, is a required third beneath anything like a subject or object distinction, right? And we saw this in also the Essence of Truth essay last December, right? There is a simple condition of possibility kind of argument that any neo-Kantian would recognize for what is required for anything like truth to transpire. And the first thing that is required for truth to transpire is the openness of the space of traversal between the mind and the being, right? So the structural requirement for the open is there in the relational nature itself. And that means that it's being open in that sense is a deeper sense of true than the accuracy of an appearing to. That's the claim of the Essence of Truth thing last December. So I'm just trying to explain to you where the open comes in Heidegger's own machinery, right? So open is already telling us something that the essence of truth has to be in something like openness, right? Okay. The next thing is, can we equate openness with simple perception? And I think the answer winds up being no, right? But it's complicated. Why not? There are people who try to turn truth as open into just appearance, meaning appearance as appearing to, meaning to a psyche. I'm thinking of Protagoras, right? He wrote the whole essay, whole big book on truth. We know most of it's lost. We know its first line: man is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. And the thesis of that book, we know because there's a critique of it in the first half of the Theaetetus, is that knowledge is perception, right? That knowledge of truth arises from perception, and this is the classic of Greek relativism, right? So it makes appearing as appearing to the standard of truth, and anything that appears to the mind as it appears to that mind is what is the truth to that mind, right? That's what you get in Protagoras. And the Platonic objection to this, or the Socratic objection to this, is that you don't get a univocal truth, you get a perspectival truth, and you make man the measure instead of God the measure, and you cannot differentiate between the wise and the unwise, and a whole bunch of other things, right? The whole first half of the Theaetetus is the critique of this position of the sophists, that knowledge is perception. Knowledge is perception, and truth is to be true is to be perceived, line up with one another, right? So the Socratics thinks that they have argued or proved that truth has to be something more than perception. Okay, but if you go to intellectual perception that is not fooled by a mere appearance, that is not fooled by a pseudos, then it's much closer to being what Plato, for that matter, Aristotle, actually think about truth. So this complication coming in from the pure perception sophists is the reason why you get all of this layer of pseudos and layer of correspondence put on top of the general underlying arising, appearing notion of truth. I'm going to pause there to see if that part made sense. I'm talking about history here, but
Right. No, that's great. Then you broke those up into two distinct components. That helps
Yeah.
a lot, very much.
Yeah.
Great. I love the way you broke it down and that you
Yeah.
made a clear distinction. Took care of this part, got it, perception. Then yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So then the point is that in the stuff that Heidegger is doing here, he is claiming that the focus on the correctness of a perception, the correctness focus, the not being pseudos focus, the right opinion, agreeing with the being, that coming after Aristotle supplants the previous understanding of the need for truth to be a matter of arising, appearing, and we get truth as correctness. And the claim is that this is a eclipse of the original need for shining forth, appearing, the whole light business that Plato was all about, and that the previous plane of Lethe and the whole mythological layer was all about, right? That is replaced just by the only thing that matters is the correctness of the correspondence between the mental image and the actuality outside. So an inside-outside correspondence becomes the test of truth as opposed to falsity, not truth as opposed to hiddenness, right? So that, and the claim is that sets metaphysics on the trajectory that it's on and towards a subjectivism. It's only incipient in the Greeks, but by the time of a Descartes, and certainly at the time of the German idealists, it's more than implicit. Sorry, Josh.
Yeah, I was thinking about Heidegger's, when he depicts subjectivity and the subject-object relation, and the object is that which appears before subject.
Yes.
Before you even get to talking about the object, and the object is presupposed, and what it's presupposed by is what is supposedly what is assumed about the subject within itself, and that is self-identity, pure self-affection. That the subject it gathers itself within itself as, S equals S, subject equals subject. That's the pure self-affection.
By Fichte, yes. I mean, earlier people like Descartes don't have that yet, but by Fichte, absolutely correct. Keep going.
Well, so comparing that with what one can see how one could take the notion of the shining, of this clearing, and argue on the one hand that it's not subjectivity because there's no object, there's no appearing before an object. It is just what it is in itself. But in talking about it and thinking about it in terms of this pure in itself, that one in fact is talking about what for Heidegger is subjectivity, even when one thinks one isn't doing that, because one is thinking one has avoided that by disconnecting this sort of the binary of an object appearing before a subject, simply in conceiving of the opening as a kind of a self-affection, of a pure in itself. That already is the essence of subjectivity, if it is thought that way. And I'm just pointing that out because that can be a
Sure.
kind of a danger.
So you're not wrong, and in a way, this is kind of what Husserl does, right? Husserl has the idea that there is always the implicitly assumed subject of the consciousness, right? And everything that it contemplates or does is happening inside the Kantian I affirm, followed by content, right? But that the from Husserlian points of view, you cannot imagine yourself outside of being a consciousness that is conscious of, right? So that's the typical way that Husserlian idealism, right, comes at these things. It's not explicitly Fichtean. It doesn't have, it's not even particularly committed to any thesis about the unity of self, something like that, in the way that Fichte was. But there is a definite tradition of, I don't even want to say German idealism, because idealism in Germany, from Fichte from Fichte on to Husserl, that sees consciousness as the underlying pole of this. The other point that Heidegger makes in our reading, about this subjectivism is subjectivism doesn't go away just because you generalize the subject, right? It doesn't matter if it's the transcendental ego as opposed to an individual ego. There's individual egos in Husserl and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and there's generalized egos in Hegel and Kant, and Fichte is straddling, right? But the point is, it doesn't matter how much you generalize the ego. The ego of all mankind, the transcendental reason of all mankind will still have this same subjective structure from Heidegger's point of view, right? So, and he's, in our reading, critical of those who think that because you've moved to a collective as opposed to an individual understanding of what consciousness is like, that you have overcome the problems of subjectivism. From his point of view, you have not overcome them at all. You're still in the same situation of lacking access to being itself, and you only have access to thoughts. It's just the thoughts you have access to, instead of being only your own thoughts, are now the thoughts of the culture or the thoughts of human civilization, right? Pete?
Yeah, so so I can understand this better. In getting it back to Parmenides in a way, let's say I'm thinking of something that's not physical or present before me. Say I'm thinking of a proton, and I think of it as a ball with electrons spinning around it, or as three quarks, and so it shines forth for me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that merely doxa because I heard it from other people? And also, is that subject object because I'm thinking of an object and I'm using modern concepts? Or am I dealing with the being of the proton?
Yeah, from Parmenides' point of view, definitely doxa. From the standpoint of like modern, most of modern philosophy, definitely you are dealing with the concept. You are dealing with the construction, and the game is given away by the fact that you say, let's imagine something unphysical, like a proton, right? Protons are meant to be physical. Physics is a theory about them, but we understood exactly what you meant, because you meant more the mental conceptual understanding of the proton than you meant, you know, my table. The being you were attempting to contemplate is constituted by concepts in your example.
But it shines for me, but it's not physis in the sense of
Correct.
something visibly appeared to me.
Correct. And if we go to Heidegger's example from what is called thinking, of standing before the tree in bloom, right? He says there's plenty of people, including the Schopenhauer he had just been quoting before, who will tell you that what's actually going on is that you're having some interaction with the whole, set of Gossamer charges moving around in space, somewhere in front of you, that only create the illusion to you after going through all your perceptual apparatus that something that you can, vaguely call a tree is there, right? And that view is precisely what he's calling the subjectivist view, what is precisely what he's calling the modernist view, and a reductionist view, and that view, from his point of view, is too subjective to be true. Because the reality is the actual encounter between you and the tree it happens in time, it is. And the attempts of theory to explain away that fact fail, right? When you are actually standing before the tree in bloom and contemplating it, right? It is a being on which you are oriented, not a concept, and not a set of photons either that have, attracted your attention. Right, there is a prior orienting effect of attunement to truth, living in truth, and attunement to being, that is making it possible for any of those other things about the tree to be organized into treeness in any theory or not. right? And if all the series weren't there, the tree would still be there, right? Is the claim. Sorry, Josh.
Yeah, another way of bringing this back to how one can still conceive of subjectivity without thinking that one is well, even within Husserl. Husserl, at a certain point in his writing, he digs beneath the notion of the ego and the subject as we might think of it in terms of an ego. But the ego is bracketed, and what's left is still within his structure of time consciousness, the now. And the fact that he calls it the pure living now, what makes the now living is that the experience of the now, even before you think of it in terms of an ego, is self-affection. You can think of it in terms of sort of a voice that hears itself thinking, and it's simultaneously with the thought. There's that pure, non-mediated presence of self to self, and you can think of that even in the absence of sort of a constituted notion of a subject or an ego, and even that at that level, I think that's where if you see the distinction between Heidegger's understanding of temporality and then Heidegger and Husserl's time consciousness, you can see that there can't be this notion of the now for Heidegger in terms of a turning back to itself in a pure self-affection.
Well, I don't disagree with you, but I would put it the following way. I mean, Husserl has a time inside a time inside the consciousness, the existence of the consciousness, regardless of how not yet constituted, is it's an experienced prior unavoidable from his point of view. And the phenomena of time that you can derive from it are all inside of that. Heidegger is not thinking about that at all. Heidegger is trying to think about time as something which, if I put it this way, is way less subjective than that and way more objective than that. But it does have, as history at least, this character of, it's part of the narrative of the appearing of truth, right? But part of the narrative of appearing of truth doesn't mean happened inside of a consciousness, right? Overall, compared to almost all of the earlier moderns, Heidegger is way more objectivist, and that's not the right term, but because object still means over against the consciousness, but he's way more externalist, if I can put it this way, than they are. And that's partly because he thinks that he's already established to his satisfaction in things like being in time, that the Dasein exists outside in the truth, not inside its head. He thinks that jailbreak has occurred and that it's over, right? That argument has occurred, it's happened, it's been won, and he doesn't need to go back and revisit it again, right? He thinks he's established that Dasein is in truth and not is inside someone's head. I don't know if that helps, but all the other stuff he's doing here of trying to probe back to access to being is meant to understand the structures, universal or historic, in which Dasein lives. But Dasein living in those structures is not something that happens inside Dasein's head or a person's head. Josh, a further comment? I can't tell if your hand is still up for the past.
Yeah. Well, I think in order to have an insight, the key word here is inside, not so much head or mind or subject or consciousness, because the minute you talk about an inside, in order to have an insight, there has to be, again, a repeated self-identity, a self-affection. That's what makes something an insight. But one can argue by the same token that's what makes something external. In order to understand externality, you have to do it by contrast with internality, and you're left in the same problem. So it seems to me
I don't think it's quite the same problem. I mean, what Heidegger is left with is he knows that Dasein is always already outside and living in truth, and once he knows that, all the remainder of the investigation is about truth and being and meaning, and none of it is about self-reflection, consciousness, any of those terms anymore.
But so it's an outside that well, so one can make a distinction perhaps between, because he does, at least in translation, that the term outside, but I think that he would make a distinction between outside, whatever the original German is, and a notion of the external, because I think that they can be differentiated in important ways.
To me, the critical thing is that his objection to subjectivism is that it has cut off actual access to truth. And he thinks that actual access to truth is actual, realized. And subjectivisms that don't have that are just wrong from his point of view. So anyway, this is getting us a little farther afield from our text because we're going to spiraling off into other things about Heidegger in general. It's not bad stuff to talk about, but it will. We can talk about it in any subject of any Heidegger text, as opposed to the one we have in front of us. But do you have further things on that? We already talked about the Adello close business. All right, I'm looking at what I have in my notes, and a bunch of these things we've already got to because we accelerated some things. But I wanted to talk about the truth and the invisible. Okay, what is this related to? So Heidegger does this thing where he doubles closure. What do I mean by this? He wants Lethe to be kind of like the closed off with this Adello structure, but then he wants there to be some notion of a sheltered or sheltering about truth itself. And this is definitely this is kind of a reading in past what's there in the Greeks. It's coming from his choosing the word disclosure and reading the German prefix ent two different ways, right? So he does not want closure to mean untrue, right? He needs there to be a closure in which truth can be sheltered as well. Why am I bring this up? I want to contrast a little bit this with the Plato part. When I say the Plato part, I'm thinking of the Greeks and the plane of Lethe stuff. He was in the previous section, which is the background for him talking here about closure and disclosure. I want to make the point, I think I may have alluded to this last time, that all of the mythic levels of Plato are talking about this visible, invisible as true and untrue. But where Heidegger isn't completely wrong is that it's always done in this somewhat paradoxical way, right? What do I mean by somewhat paradoxical? The true at which Plato is always attempting to arrive is not simply the apparent. So truth is arising, appearing, truth is being in the open, truth is being in the light, but that doesn't mean that it is the easiest, most obvious thing that goes without saying, because there is appearance and even false appearance that can overlay it. Okay, I want to substantiate this quickly from the mythic levels of Plato. So there's 4 different invisibilities in the Republic. For example, we have the plane of so the myth of the plane of Lethe and the myth of at the end that Heidegger is making explicit here. But earlier we have the cave, right? The cave is a hidden away in which the truth cannot be seen, that you have to break out of into the open and into the light above, that gets you to truth. But it's the opposite of the apparent, or the divided line, where the lower levels of the divided line are the experientiable, the aestheses that can be sensed, as opposed to the noetic, the noetically perceivable, the what can be thought, which is the level of the more true, so to speak, but also the less immediately apparent. And back at the very beginning, the whole thing is set up, the whole dialogue of the Republic, I mean, by the question of the myth of the ring of ancestor of Gyges, the ring of invisibility. And what is the invisibility involved? It's being able to hide that one is actually unjust by appearing to be just, right, as a means of power, right? So the the fake appearance, the conventional appearance, the sensed as opposed to the thought, and the up above in the light versus disappearing into the plane of lethe, all of those are this true and visible in the true sense versus only apparently visible, which is only the apparent, which is in the false sense, right? And you get that over and over again in Plato. So the true is always being related to the visible, that can be seen, but it's never the immediately bodily seeable. The immediately bodily seeable is exactly what is misleading in Plato. Any questions / thoughts on that structure and reversal? Okay.
I have one question.
Sure.
We can make a distinction between the contrast between the true and the seeming versus the true and the apparent. Or would you? Okay.
So the point is that it is easy to think that arising, appearing, and being visible and being in the light as notions of truth would imply that the sense visible and the most apparent is already the true. And that is the opposite of what you get in Plato. There's complete agreement that the visible and the being in the light is what counts as true, but these are all understood on this noetic understanding sense and not on this sense experience level. On the sense experience level, that's exactly where the pseudos and the deceptive can arise, the seeming, the doxa. And everything you got in Parmenides as the way of doxa is exactly correlate with what you get from the merely sensible layer of appearing in the light in Plato.
So would it be correct then to say that if one takes the opposite of seeming, it seemed to be, but it's not, but then this really is that one is not understanding truth in the way that Heidegger is trying to get us to.
So if the only way that you're arriving at the belief that it is true is because it is the opposite of a seem, then yes. But what you're instead getting in Plato is the same understanding of physis as arising, appearing, being in the light, etc., on the level of noetic perception, noetic intuition, or noetic understanding. But all of those are being distinguished from sense appearance and doxa. And I put it to you that this is doing the same job for Plato that the denigration of subjectivism is doing for Heidegger. Dan?
Yeah, in Plato, isn't this coming like he was always like with doxa, and as Plato's an aristocrat, he always like he was suspicious of the masses, and that's one way, like it's whatever, and that they go to what's obvious, and then on the other hand,
I'll slow you down there for a second.
there are
I'm sorry, can I slow you
the
down there for a second?
sophists who are kind of.
Sorry, you're breaking up.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. You just stuttered a little bit. I was trying to interrupt you on your first point and react to it, but sorry, I'll let you finish because we got broken up a little bit.
So again, 2 points like for Plato to me, like his practical kind of points. One is that he was an aristocrat. He always mistrusted the masses, and masses usually whatever it's in front of them, they took as truth. So it's kind of go back to this doxa issue. And the second one, there were the sophists around that kind of mixing things and presenting things, like putting things in front of the real ones and then presenting those as truth.
So on the first point, right? I mean, he in the same dialogue, right? He says that the greatest sophist is the political multitude, right? So the diagnosis of the sophists, both there and in the Theaetetus, is that they are the flatterers of that multitude, right? So they flatter doxa, they tell the political multitude what it wants to hear, but all of this are substitutions of seemings for truth, something like that. So I'm not disagreeing with you. That's the aristocratic attitude / prejudice, if you like, that you're talking about. The thing to understand about the sophists, though, is the sophists don't just claim appearances are true. They claim to be able to manipulate the appearances to achieve what truth would achieve, right? They claim that the operational cash value of truth is what you can achieve with it, and the way you can achieve that includes sufficiently convincing seeming, right? The critique of this you get in the later Platonic dialogues, something of the sophists in particular, is they think they can make everything by describing it, right? So they have a tendency to conflate the verbal description of things with the reality of things, and with the ability to speak about, with the ability to understand, right? All of these are part of the same unified critique of sophist, political multitude, appearance, way of doxa, that are all being contrasted with the way of truth, the way of the difficult to discover, intellectually verified, whatever, right? Was there somewhere else you wanted to go with that contrast? I'm not disagreeing with you that that's there in Plato.
No, it's just it seems like it's the background that he's kind of using. But now that I think more, there is this kind of like also the all his ideas are not obvious. They are there in, like, you need to kind of go through those to get to the truth. And
Yes, I mean idea. So this is coming back to reading for a second, right? When Heidegger allows that this Greek understanding is all about this appearing in the light, this already shows that the idea notion in Plato is not the distortion of the experience of aletheia. It's in line with it, right? The idea is exactly what is shown in truth. Sorry, is what is uncovered. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and one more thing, like they have this obsession with mathematics, not just all of them, like these ancient Greeks. And it's kind of like that something is there, it's hidden, it's they understood truth in connection also with mathematics, the numbers and so on.
Yes, in part because it's something where it's a standard of truth that can be known. What's the critical thing? The critical thing about the truth of mathematics for the Greeks is that it is for them provably beyond convention, right? It's a truth which is accessible, which is not a matter of agreement, something like that. Pete?
Yeah, so with Plato and the cave, and in terms of Heidegger and Aletheia, that if a person sees the shadow of an eagle and takes it as an eagle, or they see the eagle in the daylight and they take it as an eagle, they're both the same sense of being, that it's being an eagle.
So not necessarily. Heidegger, in his interpretation of the allegory of the cave, does insist that the denizens in the interior of the cave who are only reacting to shadows still live in a form of truth. They're still reacting to a form of truth as it arises for them. The difference is the shadow eagle doesn't behave as the real eagle behaves. The shadow eagle behaves as the puppeteers of the eagle icon wish it to behave, right? Whereas the actual eagle out in the light is out in the light. It's in truth. It is uncovered in truth, and in that sense, the truths ascertained about it have an independence of artificiality and convention that the shadow eagle does not. Right, and that matters to Plato more than it matters to Heidegger, but it does definitely matter for Plato. Heidegger, in the Essence of Truth essay, insists that in both cases, even the captive person is, as Dasein, already living in a form of truth. It's just that truth is narrowed by his experience, if that makes sense.
And so in the same way, if I watch an eagle on a nature show versus seeing an eagle in the sky, watching the show, I'm like in the cave, I'm not getting the full eagle.
Yes, and especially if it's a
If
cartoon,
somebody,
especially if it's a cartoon documentary.
well, yeah, but just like there's somebody manipulating the shadow for me to
Yes.
see the shadow of the eagle.
Yes, and they
There's a
can
cameraman,
who's
etc.
choosing what to show you and all kinds of. There's an editor and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, I'm just saying that the cave can be more extreme even in that case. But yes, in both cases there is a filter between you and truth. But again, these are things which are of more concern to Plato than they are to Heidegger. I just want to bring out the fact that in all of the Platonic understandings of these things, he is not deviating from the aletheia understanding of truth, but he is, because of in part because of the threat of this office and because the arguments this office make that being is perception or something like that, to be is to be perceivable, to avoid the pitfalls of that kind of subjectivism, so to speak. In his own day, Plato insists that the shining forth that happens is not simply the sense perception shining forth. Right? Sorry, Josh. I know you've been waiting a while.
Yeah, could you speak to the relation of between being and becoming, say, for Plato and the Sophists, and how mere seeming for them would be in terms of sort of just the mere arising and disappearing and sort of the inconstancy is what would be associated with mere seeming, and that is what would make it a becoming, whereas being would be maybe something in a transcendent supersensory realm. So you've got this dichotomization.
Poetic, yeah. So you're not wrong. I mean, that you really don't get this in all of the non-sophistic Greeks. You don't get in Heraclitus, for example, but in Plato you definitely do. This is related to this point I tried to make earlier about truth as a saving region, something like that. And Heidegger does think that there's a notion of a sheltering of truth as a saving region. In Plato, that saving is a saving from time as well. And now Plato does not think that it is the case that there is no truth of things of the senses. This is a discussion of the divided line in the Republic particularly. But there is, it is easier to arrive at clearer and more stable truth about the noetic things than about the sense things, precisely because the sense things saturated with the categories of time and change are uncertain and changing underneath you, so to speak. So the way in which that is discussed in Plato is not that there is no truth about the temporal, but that it is harder to arrive at truth about the temporal because the things that you are reasoning about are changing underneath you. You get a version of that gets even more extreme in Aristotle at times, despite his insistence upon the material beings as being the most real. There are places in posterior analytics where he'll claim that you cannot have full knowledge of something which is inside time, which is way more extreme than anything you get in Plato, by the way. But yes, there's this notion of it's not even just that the thing is changing; it's that the categorizations under which you're attempting to think about it, it is failing to maintain its fit to them. This is a point that Nietzsche made much of later. There is a approximation or falsification involved in using your reasoning categories to try to snare the empirical thing if the empirical thing is mutating away from the definition that you cast for it, if that makes sense. So that is a notion of a slipperiness of the items within the realm of becoming that you do get in the Socratics. That's partly there in Plato, and that is paradoxically even more extreme in some of the theoretical writings of Aristotle. Dan?
To me, it seems like in this story with being, becoming, like in being there is only truth, and becoming there is in the limit there is no truth, like Nietzsche says, like there in becoming it's truth is just a fantasy, and there it comes with this all this technology and subjectivity to extreme. You just stamp that becoming with with some permanence in form of will to power or technology, and you put some truth there to
So
stabilize it.
I'm not going to disagree with you, but I mean, just to highlight this for other people, right? What you get from Nietzsche is the idea that the truth that matters in the realm of becoming is the truth of what you can do with something, the pragmatic truth of what you can use it for. It's the kind of error without which a creature like you cannot live. But that just means that what matters for you is, can I use it as a crude understanding / misunderstanding to manipulate things in ways that achieve the ends I value, right? And this is a dramatic reduction in the truth claims being advanced about things in that realm, while at the same time a dramatic increase in the claim of their manipulability, right? So it winds up being that this is partly why Heidegger makes so much of the notion of technology as a mode of revealing, right? There is something revealed about things in the chain of becoming when you know their causal pathway interactions enough to manipulate them, right? The manipulableness of the centers of force for the sake of the ends you posited for them is what becomes the notion of truth that is revealed by the technological understanding. But the technological understanding is more or less equivalent to, it's an external equivalent to the internal Nietzschean sense of projects of my will useful for my purposes. Josh?
Yeah, I just wanted to add when Nietzsche says, when questions the privileging of the value of truth over fiction, he's still honoring truth or understanding truth in the sense, in some way, as correctness. Even when he thinks of it in pragmatic terms, it's still understood in terms of correctness. Wouldn't you agree for him?
Yes, but I wouldn't call it honoring it. You're correct that is how he's understanding it, but he's precisely saying that because the only thing you can do with the truth inside of becoming is use it to manipulate things. If an untruth is more successful manipulating things, the untruth is simply better than the truth. But that doesn't mean he would call it true. He still is equating truth with this kind of correctness picture for sure. But he is claiming that the value position, and even above it, the justice position, is higher than the truth question, or as he would say, art is worth more than truth. And as Heidegger would put on top of him, justice uses both art and truth for the service of life. The service of life is the highest end to Nietzsche.
And for correctness, but before Nietzsche, it was kind of like we adjust to kind of to objects, we reflect them. While for Nietzsche is like we make the objects to follow our representations. It's like the direction is reversed, and it's
in a way. I mean, so this is Heidegger gets at this in our reading where he discusses the Nietzschean Superman idea as a counter essence to the Hegelian notion of absolute spirit, right? And the point is that you get the same subjectivism in Hegel, but the subjectivism in Hegel is along the lines of the collective understanding of the concept of the thing becomes the reality of the thing to which we adapt. We become rational when we internalize that societal, socially constructed, received wisdom, understanding of the thing, and therefore are fully adapted to it. At that point, it becomes a part of us, ceases to be an exterior unwilled, and becomes part of a human project. It becomes a piece of art. So transforming the real into art, becoming rational, and moderating your own internal understandings of things to conform to what that collective rationalizations of things projects for them as objective, are equivalent statements for Hegel, right? So there is a sense of correctness as getting one's own consciousness to correspond to the concept, but the concept that it is getting it to correspond to is itself an artifact of a mind bigger than you, right? Of a collective mind. So in the change from Hegel to Nietzsche, you have a change in the mode of who's doing the adapting. You have a change in whether it's thought of as rational or not rational, but there's also just a direction of, let's go to this way, command. Nietzsche thinks that this is a willful process in which differing wills fight and impose themselves, and Hegel thinks that it is a waking up or realization process in which a a single truth that is shared across minds is discovered and people conform to it, right? So there are all those differences in the moments, but the underlying picture that the objects are concepts of them for all operational purposes is shared by both. Nietzsche just thinks that that doesn't have to correspond to what it really is if it's more useful. Yeah, fair to bring this out, and Heidegger there's plenty of places in our reading where Heidegger is trying to point out these things about Nietzsche, because there's definitely people in his audience who think that the Nietzschean understanding, because it departs from Hegel, or because it departs from even in Hegel, if it departs from individualism, that it overcomes the problems of subjectivism. He's at pains here to say, no, that's not the case. All of these are subjectivist philosophies from his point of view. All of them are not it's not open is not quite the right word. None of them believe that you can have the kind of access to the true of the ungrounded open that Heidegger is claiming you can have, right? They are all pessimists about the possibility of truth in the sense that Heidegger means truth, and are substituting one or another subjective version for it instead. Okay. We talked previously about the Chronos higher than Zeus or not. I mentioned earlier the fact that there is a way in which light metaphysics is not light metaphysics, the Platonic metaphysics that wants truth to be a haven from time itself, may be a way in which metaphysics is at war with time. But I want to make the point that that is authentically Greek in Plato. It's not unique to Plato that's there. It's there in the Uranos being higher than Chronos. It's there at the mythological layer level. It's there in Parmenides, right? It's the sense of saving something into truth as saving it from the mortality of declining into oblivion. That is itself not a late distorted Platonic only notion. It is all of the Greeks notion. Okay. Okay, we talked about okay, there's one other connection here. Okay, I want to talk about the transition from Platonic understanding to the subjective understanding that Heidegger identifies as after Aristotle. And I think fairly so, but I want to draw a point here that shows how the two, it was easier to conflate the two. What's the thing that's going on? So first of all, Aristotle is going to tell you that he doesn't know where the ideas are, and the only place he can think of for the ideas to be is in the mind. And if the ideas are in the mind, then the idea understanding becomes way more subjective for Aristotle than it was intended to be by Plato, right? So by the time of De Anima, which Heidegger quotes here, where Aristotle says, in a way, the soul is kind of the beings, right? There's a doctrine in Aristotle that the mind becomes the objects that it thinks when it thinks veridically, right? The notion that where ideas are is as patterns in minds. All of these are part of moving the domain of truth away from the domain of an arising appearing between that's more like Heidegger's open, and moving it into something like the consciousness, or the correspondence between what is in the consciousness and what is outside the consciousness, right? Sorry, Dan?
Isn't this the move with the categories? Isn't Aristotle the first one who suggests categories, and then we are stuck with them since then?
He does suggest the categories, but I think that this is separate from the categories business. This is stuff you find in De Anima, where he's trying to explain how true understanding can happen. The underlying thing to realize is that ideas for Plato are an attempt to understand how veridical understanding can happen. You've got a mind which is in time finite, and it is trying to understand a truth which may be objective and eternal, right? How does that happen? How does that transpire? And what you get in Aristotle is moving that inside a doctrine about psyche, doing that inside the mind, right? And that's not simply about categories. There's a lot of people that will put this onto categorical thought, but the categories are just the forms of the possible judgments or positings. But the fact that the place or site in which anything like idea happens is not being looking into the thing and the mind being able to see it as arises and appears, but is instead a pattern in the mind that may or may not correspond in the manner of correctness with something outside of it. That change happens in Aristotle. It's clear to me. Okay, but the place I was going to next. Sorry, Dan, you have another comment, or still just?
Yeah, I think Aristotle also did another move. He took the time and made it objective as the sequences of nouns. And I think
Yes.
it's at the same time, like he moved time outside and make it objective and make it as then this is also part of the kind of the project that Heidegger is going to fight against. Like not just, I think it goes together with what you said, I think, in my opinion.
You're not wrong that Heidegger does trace that development of the understanding of time to Aristotle. He also thinks that the understanding of time before then was crude, if you put it that way, right? But certainly time in Heraclitus, or time as the background of the blossoming forth and passing away of an Anaxagoras or something, is not Aristotelian time, which has already been mathematized, so to speak. The mathematization of time is definitely Aristotle. But I wanted to get at another point here, which is that there's a way in which this okay, the underlying thought / difficulty comes from what I will call a theological idealism. Why does it come up? You can think about once Aristotle has moved ideas inside minds, right? The external beings are whether or not they would correspond or not, unknown. But if you posit that the beings themselves are thoughts in the mind of God, you overcome the distinction. You synthesize them, right? And this is definitely what you got in people like Philo of Alexandria, many of the Middle Platonists, right? There's plenty of people that put these things together by having a theological idealism that will have the subjective character of, if you want to put it this way, subjective in quotes, the not the subjective, the thought character of beings that you find in Aristotle, but will still make that something which is independent of human beings, independent of human minds, because the mind involved is not the mind of a human being or even the mind of human beings collectively, but the mind of God, right? So you get the notion that the beings are the thoughts of God. And you get this throughout the Middle Ages as well. Sorry, Dan?
Yeah, one more on this. Is it also the idea that the God is the primal being, the first cause? It's also coming with.
Yes, there's multiple versions of this, but I mean the later form of it is Aristotle had God as thought thinking itself, but the thought thinking itself that is thinking the things, then the things are the thoughts of God, and so objective reality is the thought by God thing, and subjective reality is an attempt to correspond to that. And Heidegger points out in some of his other essays, The Essence of Truth, one we read in December, for example, that you find that in Meister Eckhart, for example, who's trying to think in terms of, what is this in the mind of God? You get that in Descartes too, right? So there's this thread that goes from Aristotle to Descartes, I would say, along which the Aristotelian understanding of correspondence between thought and truth is its most overt subjectivist consequences are blocked by the thought that the thought involved is divine thought, not human thought, right? So divine thought winds up playing the role of this third between truth as a kind of outside and non-subjective truth or standard, and thought likeness, right? Those two get the the outsider objective truth is made thought-like or mind-like by being thought of as thoughts of God rather than thoughts of human beings. This opens the way in later German idealism, especially Hegel, to turn to replacing that divine mind with a collective human mind, with the spirit of the age, with the transcendental consciousness, right? This is the ontotheology structure that you get in some of the other referred to in other places in Heidegger, right? So the point is that the collective mind that you get in the later subjectivist modern philosophies is a replacement substitute for the divine mind that you get already at the time of the Alexandrian Greeks and the late ancient world and through the Middle Ages. Okay, I want to just lay out that there because that structure helps tie together this history and see why you didn't go immediately from Pythagoras and Aristotle to Hegelian subjectivism, right? Dan?
Yeah, and this structure, you said it's replaced, God is replaced to an objective mind or collective mind. Isn't also what reason did and certitude? Like replace
Reason,
kind of
especially.
God, reason, yeah.
Reason for sure. Certitude is the structure that you get with Descartes, and that's a different subjective move. The certitude move that you get in Descartes is the idea that I do not try to ambitiously claim that my claims are true about the external world, but I can claim them as honestly true about my experience. And that is a pulling in of the ambitions of making truth claims about the exterior world in order to make them certain as only truth claims about your subjective experience. That's the actual certitude move that you get in Descartes. Descartes then has some confidence that the things that he is certain about will be true objectively. And where does he get that confidence? He gets that confidence from the idea that God is not a deceiver, right? But the point is that, and that's already preparing the way for the Hegelian replacement of individual mind with collective mind. But between the late scholastics and Descartes is in a way less dependent upon the idea that this is a thought in the divine mind, because he's restricting the mind that he is paying attention to his own as the place where he can find certainty. But the subjective certainty he arrives at, that it corresponds to something objective, is still a theological leap for him. And that's why there's all these problematics after him of people talking about trying to get the separated Cartesian consciousness to make contact with the external world and so forth without involving the theological leaps that actually did it for him. But what actually winds up happening by the time of Hegel is that instead of trying to do those repairs on Cartesian skeptical subjectivism, you instead go back to the divine mind structure. But now the divine mind is not a human mind, not the divine mind. It's the collective consciousness of mankind mind. It's the spirit of the age, the transcendental reason of Hegel.
And also, it seems to me like once there was God there, the subjective and objective were kind of in a balance. They stay, but once the kind of God disappeared from the picture, this balance became unstable and eventually collapsed, like in subjective, like with
Yes.
all these are representation. Everything happens in our minds, and it's kind of we live in that world these days.
Yes, the collapse. Okay, there's a balance between them. That balance between them has a cost, which is a closing off of some of the original access to exterior is the wrong word, experiential truth that you had in the original Fuzes stuff, which is what Heidegger is decrying and calling the soul structure metaphysics. So there is a cost to that balance. But yes, you're right that there's a balance between them before the Cartesian certainty move. Hegel thinks he's restoring that balance by bringing in something which is equally subjective and objective in the collective consciousness. But most people, certainly after him, certainly I would say most people today, think that was clearly an illusion, to think that is actual substitute. It's actually an extremely subjectivist thing. The fact that it is a consciousness of human minds is no replacement for the truth that makes the beings, whether that is thought of as a divine thought or is thought of as a prior nature. Anyway, the point is that in his own understanding, Hegel does think that he is restoring a balance that's been lost since the Socratics in the modern period by an excess of skepticism. That's his own self-understanding. Great questions, by the way. Okay. All right, I want to come back a little bit to this Keith's original question. What is truth for us now, right? Being is the open, the groundless, and the free, right? Thoughtful memory and poetizing beings. He also has this whole poetry of the evening lands. What is he getting at here, right? So the Heidegger is not just telling us that for now the structure of the open is the groundless and the free, and freedom is the essence of truth. That's basically what he tells us. He had already told us that in the Essence of Truth essay we read last December, but it's here explicit as well, that the essence of truth is freedom. He'll tell you that, and then 5 pages later at the end of the essay, he'll say, we do not know what the essence of truth is, right? But the current proposal he has for understanding essence of truth is as the groundless free, and the open comportment is open to the mystery of the groundless free, something like that. But he will also say at the end that this does not mean that the inquiry is done. We still do not know what the essence of truth is. So those are in a little bit of tension with each other, but he does claim a lot for what we can know about it. He also claims that this is a recovery of the level of aletheia, and that it is in the Greeks, that is, and that it is a step beyond them in the sense that it completes the unthought in them by replacing this yoke of the light with the actual structure of the open, which is in a way a cleaner, more condition of possibilities of truth relationship that is meant to make anything like truth as correspondence possible as a prior structure under it. He also wants all that to be happening inside a history, which is the history of the revelation of the truth of being. Right, so he's historicalized this whole thing, right? So the era in which truth is understood as the groundless free is a possible future era of philosophy that will get back to the level of the founding in the Greeks, and is the possible site of the other beginning, to tie this into the stuff we got from contributions. Okay, and he gets poetic about that as relation to the evening lands. The morning of the original beginning in the Greeks, and the evening of the West. Abelanda's is West, is evening lands of the other beginning, based upon the notion of the groundless free. So that's the general structure he's laid out here about what he. And I don't want to bury all that, because you don't often get a philosopher telling you that much about what he thinks the actual answer is, right? They'll often tell you all the deductions along the way, and he doesn't just not point to something. The thing he points to may be abstract. It may be difficult to grasp or difficult to see the import of, but he thinks he can tell you what the essence of truth is for us now as the groundless free open, where Dasein acts as steward of the truth of being, and as shepherd of the history of its unfolding in the kinds of phases of what happened in the first beginning and what's happening now. Dan?
Yeah, and connected this and connected with the event book that we read and what we are going to read next, the origin of the work of art. I think he's kind of like in the event there, he said that he's not telling what kind of true is, but he's kind of preparing the ground for someone to come and tell us that. And that's usually it's you do it in a work of art. Someone needs to come and show it to us the way the Greeks experience in their art, and then they acted according to that, and then, well, no, that collapses again, and then we need another true fix in our work of art, and so on. And it's Heidegger is not telling what true is, but he's kind of telling this big structure that Point us that way.
I don't disagree with you. I even read the inclusion of the Rilke stuff at the end as a disappointment of, I wish we had a poet who could tell the story of the way I'm telling it here, but instead we get Rilke who tells it this way, in which we can already detect all the Nietzscheanism, right? He's asking for a Heideggerian Rilke to come along and tell the story of the groundless open in a way that will move and or satisfy. I don't know how much that means he thinks all this is preparatory. He does say that. He does at the end allow that we do not know the essence of truth. When he was talking about the history, he said, we certainly do not know what the culmination of history is at the and the primordial beginning as opposed to the first beginning. Its meaning will only be revealed at the end, like the end of history, and hasn't been yet, right? So he has all these, there's all these aspects of historical tentativeness in what he's doing, but the content of what he's claiming about truth isn't actually all that tentative, right? The only thing that's just tentative about it is that it is claiming something about a free, an ungrounded free, and in the other essay, a mystery, right? And an ungrounded free mystery can seem contentless, right? It's a unconcept. It is the abstract form. Anything can fill a content that is ungrounded and free, because that it is ungrounded and free is close to saying it's an unknown, right?
Yeah, and related to Rilke, I think my impression, I didn't get that directly from reading Heidegger, but he was kind of like he and his generation thought that Rilke will be that poet in a way. And then I remember when Rilke died, he was with Jasper, and that's the moment when he decided not to write the second continuation of Being in Time and stuff like that. And they took it as a big event in their lives. And I think hereby he progressed, and he eventually turned against Rilke and said, this is not the poet we expected and we wanted.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think he's, in his analysis of Rilke, he's right that there's nothing there going on that's any deeper than Nietzsche. He has his own love for Hölderlin instead, but there is a tendency of thinkers, including Heidegger and thinkers who are romantic especially, to expect the poets to be farther ahead on these philosophical paths than they are. This is usually not the case in my experience. The philosophers can sometimes read into the poets and find things in the poets that inspire them, but the level of the philosophical and even religious sophistication that you find in the poets is generally behind the philosophers, is my experience. And it's a rare case when the poet sees further. Now there are such cases, but and it can certainly be moving or influential, but to expect someone who is has the training and vocation of a poet to have mastered philosophy to the level that we are talking about before they put pen to paper, when most poets do their best work before they're 40, is unlikely, right? You're probably going to have to come after and be steeped in one of these views to be able to write about it that way. But next time we will talk about poetry and what art and what art can do here. Sorry, Pete. Pete, you're on mute. You're still on mute, Pete.
Yeah, so I think what he's saying with the poet is not necessarily that the poet's ahead of the philosopher, but for society at large, that it's the poet who is going to articulate something, and then the people say, yes, that's it. That's how we feel now. And finally, this poet has put it into words or a work of art.
Yes, with two exceptions, right? First of all, he does at times claim that Hölderlin is ahead in this particular issue of the possible return of the gods. But second, what we've seen here, I think accurately in some of his discussions of Nietzsche and Hegel, that a lot of the faith or hope put upon peoples is just another form of subjectivism, right? The people are not where salvation is going to happen in these matters, is the way I would put it. And I don't know that he always knew that himself, but it's the case, right? Whether he knows it or not. Sorry, go ahead.
So let's say in terms of the Gestalt, you could say, oh, there's some mystic or some philosopher who's not trapped in the Gestalt.
Mhm.
But what matters is for all of us not to be trapped in the Gestalt.
I don't think
And
it's necessarily going to be all of us, but for at least a weightier part, sure, that'd be nice. But my point is that there is definitely a tendency that he is both seeing and decrying in our actual reading to put the faith on what the people will reveal, accept, or believe, something like that, that is itself just a version of a Hegelian spirit of the times subjectivism, and that is not about truth. Now, that's not required that that be true. What I'm trying to get at is that the truthiness of the reflection has to come first, and that can be conveyed into a work of art, and that work of art can be shaping for the life of the people potentially. All of those are difficult and independent steps, but if you don't have the first one, the other steps are not going to happen. We've spoken before in some places, and we were talking about the later parts of contributions, about the kind of political naivete that is detectable in Heidegger. And this is another example of that. Expecting that the poets will lead the people to the enlightened promised land of understanding the most advanced philosophy of the age is a bit of Gnostic romanticism. And it's not how politics works. And there are plenty of people, including his own students, that were way more sophisticated about politics than he was, and understood these things. I just want to dampen down the expectations here that one is going to find the Heideggerian poet who writes the moving poems that reform the world. That's not something to expect around the corner. Okay, but we haven't gotten to the origin of the work of art and what he's going to claim it can and cannot do.
I wanted to push back on what you said earlier, that, well, not push back, question whether or not poets do their best work before they're 40. Because remember that book, The Clockwork Muse, I shared with you?
Mm-hmm.
We can into some really deep analysis on the progression. And he says basically that the best work is indicated by the amount of primordial content, not just in the poetic works, but in artistic works and in music. And he used Beethoven. Some of his best work was he was around 56 years old. So he claims that,
Yeah.
that
I'll acknowledge that some, especially in some artistic disciplines, the great work is done later. Philosophers often do their greatest work significantly later. Mathematicians famously do it very young. I'm just saying that lyric poetry is not primarily something which is the mature reflection, mature results of 65 and above people's, end of life accumulated wisdom, right? The lyric poetry that becomes popular and moves people tends to be a much younger man's game. There are exceptions; they're very rare. Anyway, it's just again, I'm just going on, if you like, historiographic externalities of these things, but it is one thing for a philosophy to have a appreciation for the potential role of works of art in exploration of truth, as we'll be talking about quite a bit next time, and something else to expect that history will move in ways it has never moved before due to novel causes, right? The latter is a less realistic expectation than the former. Josh?
I'm just wondering if you don't think that Heidegger didn't realize that this would have to be done on a one-to-one basis, that you have rare few individuals who emerge, a Nietzsche in the 19th century, and then a Heidegger, and Heidegger talked about, look, it takes 100 years before great philosophers understood. He writes about how Leibniz, it took he said, just now in our era are we beginning to understand Leibniz. So don't you think he had that appreciation that,
he certainly understands that the peak level philosophy is a peak thing, and it's few philosophers, and it's relatively slow, and it's long, and it depends upon the being fully understood by a successor who will also change what he receives, right? Absolutely. But if you look at the sections toward the end of contributions, where he explains about the future ones, about what his actual expectations are, about how that chain of philosophical thinkers will transform into something of broader cultural significance, it's all very Gnostic sect, right? He expects a few intellectual leaders to be surrounded by a smaller group of people that get and understand without actually elaborating, and he expects all of that to then inspire and organize a people, which is all like saying that this one Gnostic sect organized in this triple layer onions form will take over and use a given nation. Right. This is politically very naive, right? But even if you compare it to the level of political sophistication you get and Hannah Arendt, let alone the deconstructionists, right? It's politically very naive, right?
I'm surprised that he would say that, because it would seem to be utterly inconsistent with the way that he understands how
go read it.
Philosophy. Yeah.
I mean, for the peak philosophy stuff, he's entirely with you. But in terms of it's spreading its influence, he doesn't think it's just peak philosopher. And you can read the sections on the We Future ones in late contributions, and you can assess how politically sophisticated or naive it looks. I think it's pretty naive. But fair questions. Again, what more can be hoped for art? We will be talking about over the next 2 months. Okay. I had a little bit more about the Nietzschean stuff, but I think we actually got to that. Right. I had one minor thing about where the eclipsing of original aletheia occurs. So he says that it happens sometime after the reception in Aristotle. He claims that in Aristotle there's already both notes being heard, where by both notes he means the note of arising, appearing in original aletheia, and the note of just freedom from the pseudos via correctness. I think that the place where the turn starts is actually Protagoras. It's and the fight against him. So by the time of Aristotle, I think a fair amount of that has happened, in the sense that you've the notion of truth as being related to the structures of the open that you got in Plato has basically been abandoned. It's been replaced by a being equals truth intellectualism, if you get me, which isn't yet full correspondence theory, I would agree, but it's already made the move to inside the mind as the place or site to find truth by the time of Aristotle. But I would claim that is prepared by Protagoras. And Plato is not convinced by Protagoras, but then Aristotle is not convinced by Plato. And the result is that Aristotle is moved from the position Plato was in by that pair of fights.
There is the subjective move, but it's also the ideas move. That's the ideas provide the light, provide the to see things into, and in Plato ideas were not, or somewhere out there, and they didn't make the move inside.
Ideas are being and in the open in Plato. They're precisely this open in between business and place or site where being happens business, and they're perfectly compatible with what you get in Heidegger as being is meaning in the Essence of Truth essay we read last December, right? There's the room is there for it, but Aristotle cannot see where that open is in physical space, so he disbelieves it.
But isn't this, if we go back to Heidegger, he always said that the main thing in his philosophy is this ontological difference, to no longer see being as a being. And in Plato, when you think of ideas, you think of them as beings already. It's something like ideas are it is not being that fundamentally occurs. It's these ideas are beings that are somewhere,
So
and it's already, the movie's made.
Plato is trying to explain ideas as part of this explanation of essence, which is an explanation of being. You're right that he has other transcendental concepts besides being that he puts there. He is also trying to allow for the possibility of intellectual understanding of ideas less than being itself, because he thinks that an intellectual understanding of being and only being was already there in Parmenides. What Parmenides lacked was anything like noetic understanding of things less than all of being, right? And the ideas or highest categories are meant, highest genera are meant to, I'm thinking of the sophist, are meant to allow the possibility of understanding of things other than being in the same noetic way that Parmenides understood being itself. So is that simply the beings? Not simply. Not simply. Again, he's thinking about the things which Heidegger would describe as the structure of the open. Are those beings? Is the open a being? I put it to you, it is not.
Yeah, but when you talk ideas, the supreme, like the supreme being is the good. There are already, it does no longer being, it's beings, and to Heidegger that's metaphysics. When you can no longer think being.
From my point of view, and I acknowledge this is not Heidegger's but my own. From my point of view, when Heidegger is telling us about the structure of the open and telling us that the nature of the open is to be the ungrounded free, he is doing metaphysics, but in my sense, not his, right? And I think Plato is doing metaphysics in that same sense, right? I would even say Aristotle is still doing metaphysics in that sense as well. They're disagreeing with each other about that metaphysics, but I think all three of them are metaphysics, but not in any historically pejorative sense of a closed off from original aletheia into a subjective bubble of thoughts only happen in minds, right? If by closed off from aletheia we mean not it talks about anything more than being itself, but it thinks that access to original being is closed off to anything other than beings appearing in minds, and we interpret everything as appearance to, then I think that from Aristotle onward you have that. I wouldn't yet call that subjectivism, but it's already thought likeness, it's already mentalism, it's already psychology, if you like.
Isn't that just a move of place, like from, as you put, like Aristotle didn't know what to do with ideas and put them in our minds, and it's kind of like it's just
absolutely, but
a
the whole point
relocation.
is absolutely, but when you lose the location of truth and think that the location of truth needs to be locatable in physical space, I call that the closing off of the original, the openness to the original space of truth. I'm with Heidegger on that, right? If you look for the open, and you need to find the open within the 4 quarters of the terrestrial globe, you won't find it, right? This does not mean that the open is not part of the structure of truth. It means you're looking in the wrong place. And I think an error of that kind is what is involved, and I would call it an error, in Aristotle's revision of Plato, that is trying to make him more common sense and accessible to people. And I agree it makes him more accessible to people, but it makes it more accessible to people by distorting him, right? I can explain Dasein to people much more simply if I say Dasein is just the consciousness. But I will have butchered what Dasein means if I do that. that's basically what Aristotle did to Plato. That's my claim.
Yeah, and also relate design and openness is kind of like Heidegger is saying that it's something, it's always a struggle. It comes up in this struggle that design is being part of, and for Plato is already something static, was no longer like it's a being again. It's not.
I'm sorry, I don't recognize this, because to me Plato is as much about the dramas and the myths, and he's a writer of plays, not a writer of treatises. And the ascent of the soul above the clouds to get a glimpse of the Hyper-Uranian beings against the steeds pulling it down, or the ascent out of the cave, these are not static. They are struggles. It's just in Plato, this struggle is in the myths and in the dialogue and the action, not in a conceptual argument.
But in a way, though, you can sympathize, empathize, whatever, with Aristotle. So some things are so difficult to, let's say, get your hands around. And also sometimes, if speaking this kind of language, people that are, let's say, really committed to a materialistic worldview, they're going to immediately be repulsed by suggesting something like truth is only accessible outside of what would be the confines of the worldview. So that those are two big leaps you're asking people to make.
Sure, but if you're doing philosophy, you're asking people to make leaps about their worldview, because if they don't, they can't do philosophy. It's the entry requirement, right? If you're locked into a view of the world and you will not entertain any alternatives to it, you are incapable of opening the door to philosophy, right? It's the entry requirement. I don't disagree with you that it's harder, but I think that Aristotle met that entry requirement, by the way. I mean, he was perfectly able to reason about these things. He just disagreed with Plato because he thought what Plato was saying was unintelligible. I don't think it's unintelligible. I think he didn't understand it. Those are two different things. But anyway, this is just me breaking a lance for Aristotle and his agon against, Plato and his agon with Aristotle at this point. Okay, a perennial exercise of mine. I want to give people a chance to respond to the anything said so far, and also to summing up the book. I got about 10 minutes left, but I mean, I want to, you don't have to end that fast, but give people a chance to ask the questions about things I didn't bring up, or something was sparked off by something somebody said, assessments of the work as a whole. If not, I'll have a little bit of assessments of the work as a whole myself. I want everyone else to get a chance first. Pete, any final thoughts on part of this book?
No, as a whole, I think this is one of Heidegger's better texts. He really gets into explaining what he means by aletheia and truth, and he has all these examples from the Greeks. And yeah, this would be in my top 10 Heidegger texts. So
did the explication of what truth is meant to be for us now that I tried to run through, did it help at all, or is it still, unsatisfying?
Well, it's unsatisfying to me. I'm not saying your explication's bad. Sure.
You want more, yeah.
Or some direction in what to do. Besides, he doesn't go that. In other places, he goes more into we're waiting for the last God, or we need releasement, or whatever. And I also think with the poet, I think it's interesting that in the end he picks Trockle, and Wittgenstein also loved Trockle and thought he was the great poet of the age. I don't see. There's some interesting stuff in Trockle, but I don't see, the path forward in Trockle either.
I'd be more inclined to look for it in either Heidegger or Wittgenstein.
Well, to me, it's interesting that the two great philosophers of the 20th century both settled on the same poet. So I need to read more Trockle, I think, or more closely or something.
Maybe.
I get the Heidegger's made this open, that is the abyss, that is the freedom, explicit.
Mhm.
So now we can reflect on that, and hopefully a future philosopher or poet will come along and articulate it in a new way, so we know how to move forward and get out of the Gestell. But Heidegger is a precursor to that person.
In his own self-estimation, yes. Sorry, Dan, you have final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it was Strackle and also Paul Celan and a few others, and I know like he was there the last few years. He was going around and trying to go to different, like, meet different poets and exhibitions and music, and he was kind of trying to find the poet of the future, and he didn't find it. but no, I like this book, and I like that. I think that for Heidegger's project, truth and aletheia is central, and to under this is one of the best places. He takes it and he goes back to Parmenides, and they go this in this kind of layers, historical, and show how, like, we read this book, like this is the fourth what you call it, clause or a directive, and it's kind of presented like goes and then expanded, and more the circles are getting more interesting and more deeper, and he's moving that, and I think he did a pretty good job, given that he was a course, and it's all that stuff is in the background there, the event, and it's not finished, but it's kind of it's a path. It's going that way, and it's opening some perspectives, and he's struggling, and and as usual he drops it and starts again in a different direction.
So I got to say, my assessment of the work is that it started off kind of meandering. It's got some great topics, but it feels like it's taking a long time to get to the point in the first section or two. I love this discussion of the plane of error. I think it's great, and I think in the final section he really he steps up the game, so to speak. The last section, the one we just read, is very good, and if you read it with some care, it can give serious entry points to understanding where mature Heidegger is coming out, right? And I think that the actual picture he's presenting there as well is a very defensible one, if I can put it that way. It's a solid position. Whereas some of the things about the bastion of Rome standing in the way, I'm not so sure, right? And if I were a student in this course, I would be quite upset about how little we actually covered Parmenides, as opposed to Hesiod and Homer and Plato and Heidegger himself. It's like, where's Parmenides, right?
Not to mention Heraclitus.
Yeah, not to mention Heraclitus, who was also supposed to get to. So I get the sense in this last section that he was like, "Uh-oh, we're running out of time. I better drop some bangers and get to the point, right?" Which is fine, right? It's a course, right? But the section toward the end, where after giving you all of these, what is the truth to us now? He says, but we do not know, right, what the actual essence of truth is, and we have to keep questioning, right? That to me is a characteristically very philosophical move that I actually deeply appreciate. I don't just treat it as a trope. I deeply appreciate it. It is the honest thing for a philosopher to do after telling you, after all this history and all of these structures and laying out what his own understanding is, to say we don't actually know. Kudos, right? Correct, right? Okay, so that's part of my own assessment of the work. But I think brought out some of the ways in which it is useful for me in thinking about Plato as well as in thinking about Heidegger. If there's things in mature Heidegger that aren't really in this book, it's all the stuff about event and temporality of the event and that sort of thing. But it's just there's no time for it, right? You can't fit in everything. So it's not a criticism of it. It's just if you want coverage of that, you have to go to another text too, like contributions. Okay, so next time, origin of the work of art, we want to see in what way the origin of art is related to truth, and think of all this in terms of being as something which is has the sense of freighted with meaning, right? And we have to understand that in relation to the understand the act of existence that we saw beings do here, that was pointed to as something like this ungrounded open, right? So it's easy to think of, not easy, it is possible to think of truth and art as being related to a meaning layer that has fundamentally is fundamentally tied to human purposes, psychology, motivation, interior, if you get me. But it's also meant to be tied to truth, and truth, we just saw, includes some of this notion of a groundless, open, and free. So keep track of those two things, the meaning and the free, the ungrounded and the moving, if I can put it something like that, as we get into the origin of the work of art question. All right, I think that's all I have for this time. Thank you everyone for coming. Questions were great as usual. And this should go up on YouTube sometime later tonight. All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.